Saguaro National Park is rich in natural beauty, physical shapes obvious and attractive to the eye. Mesquite trees and hackberry bushes line the drive through spiny, cactus-studded bajadas in the east district of the park. The Rincon Mountains, tipped in a dark green cap of evergreen trees, rise in the distance from the desert floor. This is what you might see if your family drives the loop road through the east district of the park on a late summer day after the monsoon rains. Beyond this view, more wonders are hidden. Streams, springs, and tanques vein the mountains and slopes above. Water gives life to plants and animals of all shapes and sizes. Javelina, bobcat, horned lizards, and kangaroo rats. You can easily see the park's natural beauty. What you don't see, what you cannot get by driving or hiking through, are images of the past, of the people who lived in this place. Those settlers were people like you and me, with diverse interests and talents. In fact, over thousands of years, human cultures have shaped and been shaped by this extraordinary land. Today, we'll take a short journey through the history of the people of the area, especially the area in and around what is now the East District of Saguaro National Park. After an introduction to the park, we'll look briefly at its earliest inhabitants, like those who used this metate, as well as Spaniards newly arrived from the Old World. We will also learn about people who established the park and made it what it is today. And finally, we'll look at what is today. What's here for you and your family to enjoy. Saguaro National Park now encompasses nearly 100,000 acres in and around the Rincon Mountains on the east and the Tucson Mountains on the west. Today, the city of Tucson crowds its boundaries. But in 1933, when it began, Saguaro National Park consisted only of land on the east side, far from the city. The park was inspired by a forest of giant cacti unique to the Sonoran Desert. We know them as saguaros, a word adapted into Spanish from Native American languages of Sonora. With the advent of photography and film in the late 19th and early 20th century, this giant cactus became an icon of the American West. Early westerns filmed with the backdrop of saguaros gave the majestic cactus an admiring audience around the world. But the saguaro has been much more than a curiosity or a symbol to those who have long lived on the fruits of this land. It has been vital to native cultures in the Sonoran Desert for thousands of years. Saguaro fruit has provided food and drink for many mouths. These long-lived cacti have also provided homes and food for the desert's wild community. They are a critical part of the food chain for insects, birds, and other animals. Even in death, saguaros feed microorganisms and replenish the soils. Prehistoric people lived in and around the Rincon Mountains between 15,000 and 10,000 years ago, when the climate was cooler and wetter. They hunted mammoths, camels, and even saber-toothed tigers. By 2,000 years ago, the culture of the people living in the Tucson region had become what is called the Hohokam culture. The Hohokam flourished in the Rincon area between 700 to 1300 AD. However, when Spaniards arrived in the mid-1500s, the large villages and sophisticated culture of the Hohokam had disappeared. They found only scattered villages of Odham living in the valleys of the Santa Cruz and San Pedro rivers. Father Eusebio Quino first came to Sonora in 1694 to convert the Odham to Western traditions and religion. Quino found the Odham people growing corn and other native crops. Taken in 1932, this photograph depicts a typical Odham home of the time, showing how they used the natural resources of the land. Much like their ancestors, building homes and utensils from clays and plant materials, using saguaro fruit for food and drink, saguaro ribs in shelters, and ocotillo stems for fencing. Odham craftspeople still use devil's claw to get dark fibers for weaving baskets. At about the same time the Spanish explorers arrived, the Apache migrated into the region and began raiding villages, causing many O'odham to leave the more fertile Rincon and Tanque Verde valleys for the protection of the new Spanish presidio. Father Kino had brought wheat and fruit trees, as well as cattle for the mission communities, and he trained his novitiates to raise the crops and livestock. After Kino, Spaniards drove their cattle into the area, changing lifestyles and landscapes in the Sonoran Desert. The practice of open-range ranching itself came from the plains of Spain to the New World. Roundups, branding, and other Spanish ranching traditions filtered north from New Spain with its people. By the mid-1800s, men in the newly established country of Mexico had set up large ranches throughout what is now southern Arizona. Spanish was the language of the land. In fact, ranch is a word that comes almost directly from the Spanish word rancho. Then, in 1854, the United States purchased southern Arizona south of the Gila River from Mexico. Called the Gadsden Purchase, this transaction established the international border that we recognize today. Soon after the 1854 Gadsden Purchase, a stagecoach service began a route through Tucson, and regular mail service began. The seeds of a migration from the east had been planted. In Tucson, Sergeant Francisco Solano León, who'd been stationed at the Mexican Presidio, and Joaquin Tellez, who'd been living in the Santa Cruz Basin, chose to become American citizens. Both began ranching in the Rincon area soon after the Gadsden Purchase, and both became prominent ranchers. Paz Tellez de Ruiz, on the right here, was the daughter of the first Tellez settler. Her great-granddaughter still lives in her original adobe homestead in the Rincon Valley. In 1872, the raiding Chiricahua Apaches surrendered and were moved to a reservation in Sulphur Springs, Arizona. While this did not eliminate Apache raids altogether, it did make settlement a little safer. A year later, in 1873, the U.S. Army established Fort Lowell on the fringes of the Tanque Verde Valley. The presence of the military afforded additional protection to the outlying community. Pio Pico, the nephew of the last Mexican governor of California, began ranching and farming the Gallas Ranch in the Tanque Verde area in 1881. Pico arrived on the heels of Manuel Martinez, who in 1872 was the first man to settle along Tanque Verde Creek. Martinez raised cattle and, like many other homesteaders, also grew fruit trees, 400 of them. William Ory, an early Anglo-American settler, arrived several years later, driving a herd of cattle from Texas to a homestead in the Rincon area. Another development that brought new immigrants to southern Arizona, of course, was the iron rail. In March 1880, the first Southern Pacific Railroad train reached Tucson. A few years later, the Sonoran Railroad constructed a railway up from Mexico with a spur to Bisbee. By train, minerals and cattle went out, and people came in. At that time, mining was an important enterprise throughout the area. In the 1840s, gold had been discovered in California, and thousands of 49ers had headed west, some using a gold rush trail that passed just south of the Rincon Mountains. The possibility of silver, copper, or gold in the Rincons attracted prospectors too, but no large-scale operations took hold. The Loma Verde mine operated in the Rincon district of the park only between 1901 and 1903. In 1880, about 70% of Tucson's Hispanic community had recently moved here from Mexico. People like Antonio and Eduardo Carrillo, Manuel Aguilar, and Bruno Lara came to Arizona with their families to seek new opportunities, leaving behind a feudal hacienda system south of the border. They settled in the Rincon and Tanque Verde valleys. Miguel Carrillo gave Annie McKenna this photo in 1889, writing on the back, "A remembrance of the friendship and esteem to one of the most distinguished friends, as proof of the immense love that I hold for you." A romance? We don't know. But we do know that many Anglo males who came to Tucson married Hispanic women and became part of Mexican-American family groups. Some of those families in the Rincon and Tanque Verde valleys included the Rusk, Mills, Van Alstyne, Hughes, and Allen families. For protection, early settlers built their homes in clusters near extended family members or friends. Notice the names on this 1893 map of the Tanque Verde area. Grouped close together, Montejo, Doe, and Dunham to the west, and Cienaguita and Carrillo to the north. Valdez, Pacho, Campas, Lopez, Ori, Van Alstyne, Pico, and Lara in the Central Valley along Tanque Verde Creek. Martinez and Carrillo to the east. The Rincon Valley map also shows the clustering of neighbors and friends. On the left, 3 Tellez families, 2 Benitez families, Rusk, Science, Lopez, and Mills. Closer to the inner Rincon, Leon, Mariscal, Felix, and Martinez. When the Apache reservation was abandoned in 1876, raiding resumed. In 1886, Apaches kidnapped a boy from the Tellez ranch. A posse of local men chased them across the Rincons and got back the boy 2 days later. The Apaches surrendered later that same year. Most were relocated to Florida, bringing increased safety and more settlement. Dionisio Sáenz Tellez, on the left with a mustache, was probably the son of one of the Tellez men in the posse that recovered the kidnapped boy. By the late 1800s, Tanque Verde and Rincon ranchers had large numbers of cattle, and every year they worked together to round up the herds for branding and sale. By 1900, Martinez, Ori, and Eduardo Carrillo had become the biggest ranchers in the area. By the turn of the century, schools had been established in the area. Later, Frederick and Dorothy Knipe, the first Anglo-Americans to actually buy land in the Rincon Valley, built a one-room schoolhouse for the community on the Bar F.K. Ranch. Many of the children's family names in this 1935 photo are those of the early settlers. More settlers from Mexico arrived in the early 1900s, many of them Yaqui and Mayo, avoiding extermination, or deportation at best, by Mexican troops. Among those who came were Cristobal Valenzuela, Fermín Cruz, and Andrea Maria Salcido. These few filed for homesteads. Most did not. Others worked as gauchos for local ranchers. Some of them owned their own herds as well. Here, vaqueros braid rope out of horsehair on the Tanque Verde Ranch. You can see the Saguaro forest in the background. The first wave of homesteaders were obliged to grow crops to satisfy the demands of government land grants. But even after those requirements were removed, most families farmed their own provisions. A few continued to grow crops for sale. In the lower Tanque Verde Valley, families raised corn, beans, and squashes, like the Hohokam before them, irrigating with water from the creek. In an interview in 1996, Antonio Cordova related these memories from his early 20th century childhood in Tanque Verde Valley. We had a few cattle, but mostly we farmed. We planted barley, chile, squash, watermelons, corn, tomatoes, beans, and even a little wheat. With the money that we made selling vegetables in town, my father would buy provisions: salt, sugar, wooden buckets of lard, flour, rice, kerosene, and bolts of cloth. We would go to town about every 6 months, and when we returned, we wouldn't think about town until the next harvest. It was an interesting life because it was very rustic, and we were so independent. This grocery store was owned by Jose Maria Mariscal, who also had a cattle ranch in the Rincon Valley in the 1890s and early 1900s. It is likely that beef from East Side ranches was sold here, and local produce as well. In the late 1880s, Miguel Escalante managed cattle for Jose Maria Mariscal, the owner of the store we just saw. The Escalante family, homesteaders in the Rincon Valley, also lived independently on the land. Because arid land was not conducive to agriculture, ranching became the primary industry here in the early 20th century. Whatever the venture, the livelihood of homesteading men and women demanded hard work and long hours, but families and friends helped each other, and also came together for fiestas. Early homesteader Juan José Sáenz built the house behind the group in this picture. He sold it to the Knipes in 1911. Their home had the only piano and cement floor in the area, and it hosted many community celebrations. Lito Benitez's guitar enlivened that 4th of July occasion. The cottonwood tree behind the Benitez and the peach orchard beyond were planted by Juan Jose Sáenz. By the mid-1920s, the way of the West was changing. Heavy grazing, drought, and mining operations contributed to erosion and the loss of grasses and other vegetation. On the slopes and valley floor below the rincons, a generation of young Saguaro had been trampled. When Anglo-Americans from the east arrived, many homesteading families who were strapped by droughts and a slumping economy sold their ranches. In 1928, Jim Converse bought the Cebadilla Ranch from Rafael Carrillo. The Cebadilla became the Tanque Verde Guest Ranch. Here, visitors at a nearby guest ranch ham it up for the camera. At the same time, people in Tucson had begun to worry about the lack of young saguaros in the famed Eastern Stand. By the early 1930s, a movement to protect the saguaro forest had grown strong. It was championed by Homer Shantz, a botanist, avid amateur photographer, and president of the University of Arizona at the time. Shantz and others successfully campaigned with key politicians, and on March 1, 1933, U.S. President Herbert Hoover designated the Saguaro National Monument. Almost immediately, in the midst of the Great Depression, Saguaro National Monument, like other parks and monuments, provided relief for families across the country. In and around the rincons, the Civilian Conservation Corps provided paid work for hundreds of young men from southern Arizona and neighboring states. The roster of those who worked here lists many familiar names: Conson, Carrillo, Castillo, León, Lopez, Martinez, Sáenz, and more. Between 1933 and 1941, men of the CCC removed road scars, cleared abandoned homesteads, filled 30 prospectors' holes, and put literally tons of rubbish from the area into the old Loma Verde mine shaft. They built check dams to prevent flooding and provide water for wildlife. They created 6 wilderness campgrounds and constructed the first visitor center. They also built the Loop Drive. Today, the park has been largely restored to its natural state, and young saguaro like this one are repopulating the land. Although no one lives in the park today, it belongs to everyone, and all Tucsonans can visit, hike, enjoy, and learn here with the guidance of park employees. Park rangers offer learning opportunities for young people, families, and groups who want to know more about how the land, wildlife, and people interact. They lead scheduled hikes and other activities on park grounds and often bring a bit of nature into the classrooms for our local schools. Park staff also manage the visitor center and recreation areas for people like us to enjoy, including picnic areas where families and friends can gather out of doors and trails for exploring the desert or mountains. Throughout history, people have had strong ties to the land. Here in the park, those ties are still strong. We invite you to visit Saguaro National Park and remember those connections with our cultural past and with nature's beauty and bounty today. The desert is our natural and cultural legacy.